watch sat alone on a velvet stand, sealed inside a glass case at the center of the auction floor, and everyone in the room pretended not to stare at it. It was a Patek Philippe reference 2499, 3rd series, rose gold, with a perpetual calendar and a moon phase complication that had not been serviced in over 40 years. The case had a hairline scratch near the crown that the catalog described as minor surface wear consistent with age. The estimate listed was $1.2 million. The actual number, if the room cooperated, would be higher. Harlow Beckett, 51 years old, wearing a sport coat he had ironed himself that morning in a motel room 6 blocks away, stood near the back of the hall and looked at the watch the way a man looks at something he once knew by heart. He had driven 11 hours from Knoxville. His daughter, Olivia, 9 years old, sat beside him on a folding chair, with a paper cup of lemonade balanced on her knee. She was wearing her school shoes and a dress her grandmother had bought her 2 Easters ago. She had asked 3 times during the drive whether they were going to a party, and each time Harlow had said something close to yes, without saying yes exactly. The hall belonged to Caldwell & Rowe, one of the oldest auction houses in Philadelphia. The spring horology sale drew collectors from London and Geneva, watch particulars from Hong Kong and Tokyo, and a particular strain of American enthusiasts, who wore their money quietly and their knowledge loudly. Chandeliers hung from a coffered ceiling. The chairs were covered in pale gray linen. The catalog for the evening ran to 62 pages, and was printed on paper heavier than most documents Harlow had ever signed. He did not belong here by any metric the room would have recognized. He was a watchmaker, had been for 23 years. He ran a one-man shop in a strip mall in East Knoxville, between a nail salon and a tax preparation office, with a hand-lettered sign in the window that said Beckett Timepiece, Rep. Repairs and Restoration. He fixed school graduation watches and broken anniversary gifts, and the occasional estate piece that came through a local antique dealer. He was good at it. He was, in fact, exceptional at it, though only a small number of people knew that, and none of them were in this room. The 2499 on the stand had belonged to a man named Frederick Caldwell, no relation to the auction house, who had died the previous autumn at 87. His estate had passed the watch to his granddaughter, Vivian Hargrove, 38 years old, who stood now near the front of the room in a charcoal-wrapped dress, and spoke to her attorney with the focused composure of someone who had learned long ago that composure was a form of power. Vivian ran Hargrove Capital, a private equity firm her father had built, and she had tripled. She had inherited the watch along with a townhouse in Rittenhouse Square, a summer property in Maine, and a grandfather she had visited twice a year and understood, in retrospect, far less than she had believed. She had been told by 3 separate specialists, one from Christie's, one from Phillips, and one from a boutique firm in Zurich, that the watch was not working, that it had likely not been working for decades, that the movement was seized, possibly water damaged at some point in the 1980s, and that restoration was possible but would affect the sale value significantly. Her grandfather had worn it on his wrist every day for 30 years without appearing to notice or care that it had stopped. She had been told it would sell as a display piece, a collector's object, a name and a reference number. It would sell well regardless. The case alone was worth something. The provenance was clean. What she had not expected, and what no one in the room had anticipated, was the man in the iron sport coat near the back wall, or the child beside him, with the paper cup. Olivia had spotted the watch within 30 seconds of entering the room. She had a habit of finding the most important thing in any space and identifying it before anyone explained it to her. At 6 she had walked into her kindergarten classroom on the first day, and immediately located the reading corner, the good crayons, and the only other child who was nervous. At 8, she had visited her father's shop for the first time after school, and sat quietly at the work table for 2 hours, watching him use a loop and a pair of tweezers, on a movement smaller than her thumbnail. And she had not asked a single question, which was how he knew she understood something real was happening. Now she looked at the watch in the case and said, quietly, "That one's sick." Harlow looked down at her. The one in the middle," she said. I know which one. Is that why we came? He didn't answer right away. He watched a man in a navy blazer pause near the case, study the watch for a moment, and move on. He watched a woman in pearls do the same. He watched the auctioneer shuffle papers at the front of the room, with the practiced calm of someone who had done this 1,000 times and expected nothing unusual. Your grandfather knew about that watch, Harlow said finally. Olivia looked up at him. Grandpa Beckett? Yes. But Grandpa Beckett's gone. I know. She accepted this the way she accepted most things, fully, without drama, in a way that sometimes made him feel she was older than he was. Then she went back to looking at the watch. Harlow's father, Raymond Beckett, had been a watchmaker before him. And before Raymond, there had been Raymond's father, a man named Stuart Beckett, who had emigrated from Glasgow in 1947, with a set of tools and very little else, and opened a small repair shop in Philadelphia. 4 blocks, as it happened, from where Harlow was now standing. Stuart Beckett had serviced the Patek Philippe reference 2499, belonging to Frederick Caldwell, in 1973. Raymond Beckett had serviced it again in 1981. Harlow knew this because both services were documented in a leather log his grandfather had kept, entries written in blue ink with a fountain pen, describing the condition of the movement, the parts replaced, the hours billed. The log had come to Harlow in a box of shop records when his father died 6 years ago. He had read through it over the course of a winter, sitting at the same work table where he had learned to hold tweezers without shaking, and he had found the Caldwell entries on page 47 and page 89, and he had written the reference number in the margin of a notebook he kept for things he didn't yet know what to do with. When Frederick Caldwell's estate appeared in the Caldwell and Rowe Spring catalog, Harlow had been alerted by a dealer acquaintance who knew his family history and had thought he might find it interesting. He had looked at the listing for a long time. He had considered not coming. He had a shop to run, and a daughter to get to school, and a mortgage that did not leave room for philosophical gestures. But Olivia had been asking for months about his grandfather, about the shop in Philadelphia, about what it meant that 3 men in a row had chosen the same life, and Harlow did not have a clean answer, but he thought that maybe being in the same room as the watch was part of one. So he had called his neighbor to cover the school pickup for a week, loaded Olivia into the car on a Friday afternoon, and driven north. The sale began at 7 o'clock. The first lots moved quickly. Dress watches, pocket watches, a pair of mid-century chronographs that drew brief, polite competition before settling. The room was warm. The auctioneer worked at a steady pace. Olivia finished her lemonade and set the cup on the floor, and sat with her hands folded in her lap. The 2499 was lot 22. When it came up, the auctioneer spent slightly longer than usual on the provenance, and the room tightened in the way that rooms tighten when something significant is about to happen. He mentioned, almost as a footnote, that the movement was currently non-functional. He mentioned that 3 independent assessments had confirmed the condition. He mentioned that the watch would therefore be offered as a collector's piece, display condition, and that the estimate reflected this designation. From the front of the room, Vivian Hargrove did not move. The bidding opened at $600,000. It moved in increments that Harlow could not participate in, and had not come to participate in. He was not there to buy the watch. He was there because the watch was there, and his grandfather's name was in a log. And sometimes that is reason enough. When the bidding paused at $940,000, with 2 remaining parties in the room, Vivienne turned briefly, and let her eyes travel across the hall, in the way people do when they are thinking, rather than looking. Her gaze passed over Harlow without stopping. Then from somewhere Harlow couldn't quite identify, a voice, one of her associates he would learn later, leaned toward her and said something. Vivienne's expression shifted, not dramatically. She had too much practice for drama. But something changed in the set of her jaw, and she turned back toward the front of the room. The hammer came down at $1.1 million. The watch was sold. Harlow had been on his way toward the exit, Olivia's hand in his, when the room began to rearrange itself into the post-sale configuration. Conversations resumed. Glasses refilled. the next lot brought up for previewing. He was almost to the door when he heard someone say his name. He turned. A man in his 40s, slim in a well-cut suit, stood a few feet away. "Beckett? Harlow Beckett?" He extended a hand. "I'm Paul Ossie. I work with Miss Hargrove. We were told you might be here." Harlow shook his hand. "Who told you that?" "A dealer named Terence Loy. He said you have a family connection to the watch." Harlow looked at the man for a moment. Olivia was watching. "My grandfather serviced it in 1973, Harlow said. "My father in 1981. Paul Ossie nodded. "Mems, Hargrove would like to speak with you, if you have a moment." Vivienne Hargrove met them in a side room that Caldwell and Rowe used for private client conversations. It was small and wood-paneled, and had 2 chairs and a small table, and a carafe of water that no one touched. She stood when they came in, which surprised Harlow slightly. She looked at him, then at Olivia, and said, "Thank you for coming, both of you." Olivia said nothing. She was looking at the woman the way she had looked at the watch, with the focused, unfiltered attention of someone cataloging information. "I understand your family has a history with my grandfather's watch," Vivienne said. "My grandfather and my father both serviced it," Harlow said. "I found the records after my father passed." "When did he pass?" 6 years ago." Something moved across her face. "I'm sorry. My grandfather died in October. I'm still learning what it means." The room was quiet for a moment. "Paul tells me you're a watchmaker." "I run a restoration shop in Knoxville." She looked at him directly. She had the particular quality of attention that comes from having spent years in rooms where attention is a currency. "The watch doesn't run," she said. "I know. 3 specialists told me it couldn't be restored without compromising the value. They were probably right, depending on what you mean by value." She studied him. "What do you mean by it?" Harlow thought about the log, about his father's handwriting on page 89, describing the state of the movement in 1981. Noting a small crack in the mainspring bridge that he had repaired with a part sourced from a Swiss supplier who no longer existed. About his grandfather's entry in 1973, which ended with a single sentence that was not typical of the log's usual clinical tone. "A beautiful instrument. The owner winds it himself every morning." "The movement isn't seized," Harlow said. "It's locked." Vivienne waited. "There's a specific failure mode in the 2499, in the 3rd series, which is what you have. The calendar mechanism and the winding mechanism share a component that can seize in a way that presents as total failure. A lot of technicians call it at that point, but if you know what you're looking for, you can unlock it without disassembly." Vivienne was very still. "My grandfather described this exact condition in his 1973 notes," Harlow said. "He encountered it once before. He wrote down how he fixed it." From beside him, Olivia said very quietly, "He kept a book." Vivienne looked at the girl. "He kept a book?" "Dad has it," Olivia said. "He read it all winter." What happened next was not, strictly speaking, part of any official proceeding. The buyer of Lot 22, a watch dealer from Geneva, named Hubert Cailles, had not yet left the building. Paul Ossie, working with considerable efficiency and some apparent experience in brokering unusual conversations, arranged for the 3 parties to meet in the same room. Hubert Cailles, 64 years old, was a careful man. He bought watches the way surgeons approach the body, with absolute precision and a deep suspicion of improvisation. He had purchased the 2499 as a display piece, and had no interest in a restoration that could go wrong. But he was also a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where a single piece of knowledge could change everything. And when Paul Ossie described Harlow Beckett, the family history, the log, the specific failure mode, Cailles had agreed to the conversation before he was finished being asked. They sat on the small table in the side room, the 4 of them, and Harlow described the calendar winding interface mechanism and what happened to it when the lubricant dried in a particular pattern after extended storage. He described his grandfather's 1973 repair. He described the technique, non-invasive, requiring only a specific sequence of manual pressure, applied in a specific order to the crown at specific positions, that could, if the failure was what he believed it was, restore the watch to function in under an hour. Cailles listened without moving. Vivienne listened without moving. Olivia, seated beside her father, listened too, and when Harlow finished, she said, "He practiced on a different one." Harlow looked at her. "At home," she said. "He has another one. He practiced on it so he'd know." Caius looked at the girl. Then he looked at Harlow. "Is that true?" Harlow was quiet for a moment. "I found a similar movement at an estate sale. 2 years ago. Different watch entirely. Same failure. Yes. And it kept time. It's been running for 14 months. The room was quiet. Caius said, "If you attempt this and it fails, it won't help," Harlow said. "I won't pretend otherwise. If the failure mode is something different from what I believe, the watch stays as it is. But I don't think it will. What do you think the failure is?" "I think your grandfather," Harlow said, looking at Vivienne, "wound the watch himself every morning for 30 years. And I think one morning he wound it past the stopping point, and the mechanism locked, and he didn't know why it stopped, and he put it in a drawer. And I think he left it there." Vivienne's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes in the way that things shift when a person recognizes something true about someone they loved. "He was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 1983, she said. "He stopped wearing it after that." She paused. "He told my father it had broken. He never explained how." Caldwell and Rowe did not have a watchmaker's bench on the premises, but they had an examination room with good light and a magnification stand. And the head of the horology department, a woman named Frances Webb, who had been with the house for 19 years, offered it without hesitation once the situation was explained to her. Harlow carried a small kit in his car. He always had. Tools, a loop, a case of Rodico, a set of hand-setting levers, and a few other items that a working watchmaker carries the way a doctor carries certain things in their bag on the off chance the world requires it. He did not rush. He set the watch on the examination pad and spent 6 minutes simply looking at it before he touched anything. The scratch near the crown was precisely where the catalog had placed it. The dial was in remarkable condition. The moon phase was showing a waning gibbous that was, given the watch's history, 40 years incorrect. Caius stood against the far wall with his arms crossed. He did not interfere and did not speak. Frances Webb stood near the door. Vivienne sat in a chair at the edge of the room with her hands in her lap. Olivia stood just behind her father's left shoulder, close enough to see, far enough not to crowd him, in the exact position she had learned to take years ago when she visited the shop. Harlow placed 2 fingers on the crown. He had spent a significant portion of the previous winter reconstructing his grandfather's 1973 notes into a sequence he could memorize. He had drilled it on the substitute movement until his hands knew it independent of his thoughts. He knew the positions. He knew the pressure. He knew the moment the mechanism would either give or not give, and what each outcome would feel like. He worked in silence. There is no sound a locked watch makes when you first approach it. There is only the tactile intelligence of your fingertips reading what the case conceals. The faint topology of resistance. The way force travels differently through different failures. The almost geological patience required to apply enough without applying too much. At the 4th position, Harlow felt something. Not a release. Not yet. But a change in resistance. A softening like ice that has been in a warm room for 20 minutes and is beginning to remember it is water. He did not look up. He continued. Frances Webb had been in the room for 40 years' worth of equivalent moments, and she recognized what she was watching, and she did not move. At the 6th position, the crown turned. The sound it made was very small. It was the sound of a mechanism resuming a conversation it had stopped mid-sentence 4 decades ago. It was the sound of something returning to its purpose. Harlow set the crown to the correct date using the calendar pusher and wound the mainspring slowly, counting rotations, stopping at 22. He set the watch on the pad. They waited. The second hand moved. Caius crossed the room in 4 steps and stood over the watch. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, in English with the particular specificity of a man who chooses words like he chooses watches, "The moon phase is wrong, 43 years 7 months, approximately." Harlow said, "You'll want to advance it by hand. I can show you the procedure." Kayes looked at him. How long will it run? I'd recommend a full service within the next 6 months. Movement inspection, lubrication, timing regulation. Not because it needs it today, but because it's earned it. Kayes made a sound that might, in a man less accustomed to control, have been a laugh. He turned and looked at Vivienne. The watch works. I can see that. Her voice was steady. She had made it steady. But, her hands still in her lap were pressed together, with the particular pressure of someone holding something carefully. Harlow began returning his tools to his kit. Paul Ossie, who had been standing near the door for the past 40 minutes with the expression of a man who has shepherded many unusual evenings to their conclusions, cleared his throat. Miss Hargrove, given the circumstances, perhaps a conversation about. Yes, Vivienne said. She stood. Mr. Beckett. Harlow looked up. I'd like to discuss a consulting arrangement for the estate collection. My grandfather had 11 other pieces, and I've been told by the same 3 specialists that some of them may have similar issues. She paused. I'm beginning to think I should have gotten a 4th opinion some time ago. Harlow closed the kit. We drove 11 hours, Olivia said, to no one in particular. Dad said it wasn't a party, but it kind of is. From across the room, Kayes turned and looked at the girl with the full attention he usually reserved for movements under magnification. Then he looked at Harlow. She's right, he said. It is. They did not stay for the rest of the sale. Harlow collected his kit and Olivia's empty paper cup, which she had retrieved from the hall and was carrying for reasons she did not explain. And they walked through the lobby of Caldwell and Rowe and out into the night air of Philadelphia in April, which was cold and smelled faintly of rain. Vivienne had asked for his contact information and given him a card. Kayes had shaken his hand with both of his. Francis Webb had told him, very quietly near the door, that his grandfather's name was still in their house records, and that she had recognized it when the Caldwell estate came through, and that she was glad he had come. He had not known what to say to that, so he had thanked her. On the sidewalk, Olivia walked beside him with her hand in his and her school shoes making small sounds on the concrete. A block from the parking garage she stopped and looked up. Dad, yeah. The watch was sick because someone wound it wrong. Yes, and nobody knew how to fix it. Most people didn't, she considered this, but Grandpa Beck wrote it down. He did. She was quiet for half a block, then she said, Is that why you kept the book? In case something like this happened? He thought about the log, about his father's handwriting, about his grandfather's entry, ending with that single uncharacteristic sentence. About the winter he had spent at the work table, with both of their voices, somewhere in the room with him, teaching him the way they had always taught him, which was not through instruction, but through the patient, specific record of things they had noticed and thought worth preserving. I kept it because it was theirs, he said. But yeah, I think it was also in case. She nodded. She filed this away, and whatever part of her kept the things that mattered. They walked the last block to the parking garage and, in the particular silence of 2 people who have shared something they will not need to explain later, because they were both there, and they both understood it, and some things don't need to be made into words to be fully known. Inside the car, before he started the engine, Harlow sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. In a drawer in his shop in Knoxville, the watch he had purchased at an estate sale 2 years ago, a plain movement in a plain case, nothing like the $24.99, worth almost nothing, was keeping time, had been keeping time for 14 months. It did not know it had been part of a rehearsal. It only knew what it had always known, that it was made to run, and that someone had taken the time to understand it well enough to let it. He started the car. Olivia put her seatbelt on and leaned against the window, and was asleep before they reached the on-ramp. The way children sleep when a day has been larger than expected, and the body simply decides to end it cleanly. He drove south with the city lights in the mirror, and his daughter's breathing the only sound in the car, and he thought about his father and his grandfather, and the long, quiet line of men who had chosen the same small, patient life, and for the first time in 6 years he did not feel the loss of them as only loss. He felt it as something they had left on purpose, something that had been waiting, like the watch, for the right moment and the right hands.